Okay, so in my videos on racism, this video is not going to be about that. I'm moving on from that subject. But I just want to say that in the videos about racism, we got a lot of response, a lot of emotional response, but really ass-fail in terms of any, content response. The best argument I got from the whole thing was Big Lundy in his video said that, well, the term racism, quote unquote, is a time saver. And in my response to him, which I have as unlisted because I'm sick, because I think viewers coming to my channel are sick of this topic, but I'll go ahead and post a link to that video in the description of this video for those who want to watch it. Big Lundy, I think, made the best argument saying that racism is a time saver. And I argued why I think that's false, that you end up, by using the term racism, you don't save time because you have to explain what you mean anyway, and you end up having a debate about what constitutes racism, quote unquote. And so that's that. But everyone else would, well, one thing they would do is they would just assert their personal definitions. It was amazing. You got all these people commenting, asserting their personal definitions as if they know the true definition of racism. Okay, we had one guy come in and say that black people could not be racist because black people don't have power, which is false. But by their definition of racism, black people could not be racist. So we got all sorts of different definitions, as usual. We got people imperiously asserting their personal definitions, and we got lots of emotional reactions, and most of the response was, oh, Fringe Elements is just a vested interest because he doesn't want to be called racist, right? Well, and I argued, well, of course, they're vested interests as well because they continually use the term racist. Imagine someone who keeps calling people heretic all the time, and then the concept of a heretic becomes revealed as a dishonest piece of shit term, then that person is also vested interest, right? If you use the term racism a lot, and it turns out that the use of the term racism is inherently dishonest, then that does not look good on you. So you're a vested interest as well. So they're trying to make it out like I'm the only vested interest because they keep calling me it. Well, the people who are calling me it are also a vested interest. Anyway, so what I want to talk about here is the odds of you being correct. Just something to think about from a historical context. If you hold the predominant views of the day throughout history, if we look at history as our metric here, or as our comparison, then you're probably wrong because most popular, I call popular general views, what is a general view? I'll say what that is later. Views regarding economy, state, property, religion, race, right? Various general views, general views on the topics, on the macro human topics, we'll say. That's kind of vague, but I think most people know what I mean by that. And these general views throughout history, we can look back in time. First off, there's been many of them, which is evidence that most of them are wrong, right? Because there's disagreement. There's disagreement in different places and different times. They can't all be right. So, in fact, most of them are wrong because there are varying views on race, there's varying views on matters of state, there's varying views on economy, there's varying views on the existence of which god or whatever. So most general views, general ideologies of the ways of the world are going to be wrong. Okay? Most are wrong. Marxism, social democracy, National Socialism, what I call market liberalism or libertarianism, international humanist libertarianism. Okay, most of them are going to be wrong. Name an ideology. There's all sorts of ideologies. The fact that other ideologies exist means that most of them are going to be wrong. Okay? Now, so if you hold an ideology, you're probably wrong. Okay, that's just what I want to say here. Now, in the year, I believe it was 1756. You can look it up. I mean, with the internet, getting correct dates in a vlog is not very important because all the stuff is easy to look up. There's a guy named William Godwin. He was an English novelist, and he wrote about. He's arguably the first written anarchist. And by anarchist, I mean in the classical sense, not in the Stefan Molyneux sense. I mean anarchist. That's what I mean. And William Godwin, I believe in Britain, in Godwin's time, about 98% of the land was owned by something like 2% of the population. I don't know exactly what it was, but it was close to that. And this was just kind of a holdover from feudal times. This was sort of a fact that land was bequeathed to lords, and the lords just kind of held on to it. Even if serfdom was abolished, they would still hold on to the land because they had neo-Lockean property norms where land was held into perpetuity. They did not have active use property norms where, use it or lose it. For example, in the western U.S., they would have claims associations. Law without a state, oh my. In the western U.S. territories, they'd have claims association. You have to farm the land 6 months out of the year. And if you weren't farming it 6 months out of the year, someone else could start farming it, and they would come and squat on your land. And this is known as squatter's law, and they would inherit your land instead, right? They would get your homestead, right? That's where the term instead came from, I believe. Maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, England did not have that, and at the time, William Godwin supported the abolition of that. This is where the problems come from. You have all these peasants working on this land. They've been working on it. The owner of the land has never so much as even touched it. It's gone down generations where the original it's so far removed that the person who supposedly owns the land has never even been there. Sometimes they live in a different city, right? And you have all these people working on it. And they're getting the product of their labor, and why do they get the land? Because of inheritance, right? So and I am actually quite sympathetic to classical anarchists' views on land ownership. I am a big fan of active use or usufruct land ownership. So Godwin supported the abolition of private property, the state, and I say that. And I said that. I said Godwin supported abolition of private property / the state. Now, people in the U.S. today, and people in Britain today, even maniacs like Maoist Rebel News or maniac Obama supporters recognize a distinction between private property and the state. In fact, they may even be so stupid as to think that they're opposed or something. Although, to what extent does private property even exist in the U.S. today anymore? That's another topic. Property tax, that's rent, meaning that the state owns all land and you just rent from the state. But I'm digressing. So, at that time, they had a different conception of the state. Their conception of the state was that the state was private property, and private property was the state. And that's hard to get your mind around until you recognize that you have a similar conflation. And that is the conflation of law and the state. State is law, law is state. Remove the state, you remove law. Right? State creates law, law does not exist without the state. They are completely conflated. Right? And you may hold an iron certainty that a state is required for law. William Godwin did not hold that belief. Okay, he supported abolition of the state / private property. Or he would just say the abolition of private property. And by that he would mean the state. Whereas someone today would say, I support the abolition of law. Which, by the common conception in the United States today, that would mean the abolition of the state. Okay, so just because you view these things with an iron certainty, a certainty from as long as you can remember that the state is law and law is state, people in Godwin's time would disagree. In fact, most people in Britain, the date ranges are a bit fuzzy for me, but I would say at least from, say, 480 to 880. I believe it's quite a bit wider than that, but I'll just pick those dates and say that within those dates, 480 and 880, probably quite a bit wider than that, people in Britain did not have access to either king's law or church law. What law did they have access to? When peasants had disputes between each other, how did they resolve the disputes? They resolved the disputes between each other. They'd find an arbitrator between each other, or they'd work it out with themselves. And over time, precedents would build up between the English peasants. And these precedents were then enforced going forward, for fairness. Well, because you don't want different rulings for the same kind of dispute. You want fairness and consistency. Humans like that. And so over time, there built up a precedent, a series of precedents. And this series of precedents basically became the law. And this law became known not as the king's law, not as the church laws, but as the commoner's law, or the common law. At the time, the king and the church, they said, yeah, okay, whatever. They were not concerned about that. Because the state at that time did not exist for the sake of, doing for the people what they cannot do for themselves, right? Or some stupid shit that supposedly justifies the state in the U.S. today. Okay, their ideological justification was God. This is God's order. This is what God wants, and you're going to support the king because the Pope says the king ought to rule. Okay, and why should you care about what the Pope has to say? Well, because the Pope is God's representative on earth. That's why the state was there. Not because the state was utilitarian, not because the state was the manifestation of the will of the people or made life better or any of that crap. Okay, the justification was God. So, they did not know, quote unquote, like people know today, that you need a state to have law. So when the great bulk of Britain's population did not have access to king's law or church law, yet they still managed to function somehow, oh man, they were not fazed. It was not a big deal. It did not undermine their ideology, because their ideology did not include the state is necessary for law, right? Whereas that happening, that would actually undermine the ideology of states today, right? Okay, so, and regarding, I wrote some stuff down. Regarding just people thinking that they live in exceptional times. Like most ideologies throughout places and times throughout history are wrong. And most likely what you believe is wrong. Just by process of elimination. It would be highly unlikely that what I claim exists today. If you support the Republican Party or the Democrat Party, I would classify you as a social democrat. And what do I mean by a social democrat? I mean someone who supports universal or near universal suffrage and supports things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, income security, public schools, as they're called, and food stamps, those kinds of things. I call that social democracy. And you could contrast this to a Greek-style democracy where you have only the land-owning citizens were allowed to vote, and they constituted more of a broad-based oligarchy as opposed to a real democracy that encompasses all of society and supposedly existed to serve the needs of all of society. And social democracy is, I also call it, a la carte communism. It's not total communism, but it's a la carte communism. People picking and choosing what to take from others and what to, take what you have and spread it around just on an a la carte basis. But of course, this a la carte communism, it always goes up. It very rarely ever goes down because because you get concentrated benefits, diffuse costs. No one ever wants to give up what they have. What keeps getting taken from others and constantly given to them. And so you always develop, and so whenever you create a new program, you always develop a block of supporters, right? Social Security, for example, people who depend and live on Social Security, they are now a solid, rock solid block that supports Social Security. And the general population, even if the general population opposed Social Security, which they don't in the U.S. now, their support would be lukewarm, right? And so, and given that politicians are a basket of issues, not any one particular issue. You're not voting up or down on Social Security, even if the general population opposed Social Security. If the support was harder, was more absolute, the politician may find it beneficial to, support Social Security so he can get that hardcore vote and give the general public something else, right? See how this works? So the concentrated benefit diffuse cost could actually result in but I don't think that's even happening for the most part in the U.S. I think because if you poll people, most people actually do support Social Security and do support Medicare, Medicaid, and income security. And that's why social democracy just grows and grows and grows and grows until you get to currently Sweden, the state's like 54% of GDP. The U.S., the state is like 40% of GDP. And I've seen estimates of the effects of restrictions, or called regulations, kind of a loaded term, as if they regulate something or keep it regular. Something about the effects, how that's determined, that's a bit fuzzier. But I've seen various estimates all around 13%. That is about the costs of restrictions amount to about 13% of GDP in the U.S. So direct spending at the federal, state, and local level, not just the federal level, but the federal, state, and local level, plus restrictions, economic restrictions, like, for example, unemployment. People come in and they say, I'm willing to work at $2 an hour, and someone's willing to pay me $2 an hour. That's not allowed, right? So for example, the minimum wage law, that's an unemployment law. That is a restriction. It's not an employment law, it's an unemployment law. You are not allowed to employ people in this way, right? And that constitutes about, I believe, 53% of GDP. So the idea that this social democracy thing, that is predominant in the U.S., you could say there's different degrees that, well, it's the support of social democracy is bigger and different in Britain or in Sweden or Germany, but not much more. For example, in the U.S., the state spends about 65% of total spending on medical services right now. State spending on medical services is about 65% of all medical services in the U.S. In the U.K., it's about 71%. Okay, it's not like the U.S. and the U.K. and like state spending as a percentage of GDP in the U.S. is about 40, whereas in the U.K. it's about 46. All right, it's not. They're not as much different as you think. The U.S. and the U.K. are not as much different as you think. And the general public in the U.S. is not that libertarian. It is not as pro-free market as you think. And the General Social Survey generally shows that people in the U.S. support what exists. They support cuts in the abstract, but when you try to pin them down on actually cutting something, they don't want to cut. Okay, I'm going on. So that was kind of a tangent, but I thought it was an interesting tangent. Universities. Now, universities started, of course, northern Italy and then spread throughout. Universities started off, they were not called universities, they were the cathedral and monastery schools. And the church at the time needed a bureaucracy, and they needed people who were literate. So they got these people in, taught them how to read, taught them how to do things like geometry, taught them math, because they needed to manage church estates and church holdings. They needed to know how to make deals, make land deals. And so they needed to I guess, oversee construction. So to oversee construction, they needed to understand geometry. They needed to not get gypped by, contracting out construction for a new church or whatever. I mean, just all the stuff that you need to do to manage a parish. And so in order to get these people educated, and teach them all these things. And back then it was real practical, right? Well, you need to read, you need to write, you need to know some math, and you need to know some geometry. And apparently you also need to know about the stars for some reason. Why would you need to know about the stars? I'm sure there's a reason for that. But you need to know the stars and what stars are what, and how the stars in the sky can tell you what time of the year it is. And so they taught them all this stuff, and that's how it started. And over time, these... but the thing is, these monastery schools and these cathedral schools were not they did not necessarily have all the lessons in one building. What people would do is they would go and they would sign up for courses by a master or a professor. Yeah, and I always thought that the term professor sounded a lot like something Christian, like confessor, professor. He professes God's revealed word or something. So I always thought the term professor was kind of creepy, and I suspected it had Christian origins, and it does. So they would go to these professors, and they would take courses. Now, the reason they did this, they had to take courses, they couldn't just get a book and learn, was because the printing press hadn't been invented, and even after the printing press was invented, books were still pretty expensive. So it was a lack of access to books that that resulted in the course structure, where people would go to an area around a monastery. They would sign up for courses, and the professor would teach the courses, either in the monastery itself or in the cathedral itself. Sometimes they would, or sometimes they'd have it out in a field somewhere, or sometimes they'd rent a hall in a building in the town or whatever. And where they did it was not particularly important. They tell you, and you'd take your book and you'd write stuff down, and once you believed you were ready, you would have an examination, and if you passed the examination, you were a priest or something, or whatever, different examinations and all that stuff. So that's what universities grew out of. Harvard and Yale, and over time, these universities eventually the first university, I believe, came about in Paris, where you had a bunch of students, and what started there was a fight at a bar. Basically, there was a fight at the bar. The governor of Paris, he wasn't called the governor, I forget what they were called, but basically the secular governor of Paris sent in troops to break up the rowdy students at a bar fight with some people in the town. And there was a big conflict, and in the end, 5 students died. And in response to this, the professors and the students got together and formed an organization. I believe it was called the Universities of the Masters and Students of Paris. And this organization was more of a corporation. It did not have a building. It was just, we are part of a club, kind of, which did not have a building or a specific location, but it was just, and so that was the first university. And over time, these schools began to have secular training. Over time, you started to have professors profess the skills. Well, they didn't really profess, but they would teach the skills, how to be a doctor, or how to be an architect, or whatever. So secular training grew out of these cathedral and monastery schools. Okay, Harvard and Yale, let's get to that. I believe Harvard was the first university in the U.S. Could be wrong, but if it wasn't the first, it was pretty close to the first, and Yale was pretty close to the second. I'm less certain about, I don't think Yale was the second. It might have been the second. Anyway, they were pretty close to the... Yeah, Harvard was the first university in the 13 colonies. That's right. Because they went in, and there were 10 ministers who arrived in the colonies. And they were there, and they were interested, and they were building up their little settlement. And then they came to the conclusion, wait a minute, they had all been trained in Cambridge. And so they were all literate and knew how to manage a parish. But they were concerned that, well, wait a minute, there's no equivalent to Cambridge over in the U.S. So what we need to do is we need to create a new school to train ministers. I believe it was Unitarian ministers at the time. Well, it doesn't matter. And so they did. And so that's why Harvard was born. And over time, people would go to Harvard and they become the ministers. And over time, new schools would be added on. New schools that would train useful skills. And also, you would have rich parents send their kids to Harvard, and they'd make connections and be kind of a fraternity thing, kind of a social club thing. And so people who went to Harvard made connections, and that's how it became important. Now, we look at the church in the past, and the monasteries in the past, and the monasteries, and so that's something to consider, is that the universities kind of grew out of the monasteries, but it wasn't like like, for example, the foundation of Harvard as a university, that was evidence of that was a intermediate step between the university as we know it today and the monastery and cathedral. Okay, so over time, it wasn't a hard break. It wasn't like you had one phase where it was monasteries and cathedrals, and then you had another phase where it was, Oklahoma State. No, you had one phase. The phases kind of blend into each other over time, and you can draw little cross sections, and you can find different stages of this evolution. But the evolution ultimately comes from these monasteries and cathedrals. Now, when you had these monasteries and cathedrals, you had people like, St. Thomas Aquinas. And I look at St. Thomas Aquinas and I think, you know what, if one of these social democrat professor assholes lived back then, they'd be like St. Thomas Aquinas. They'd write the supposedly definitive work debunking the heretics, right? And of course, now, we know now that the heretics were right, in the main, that they were generally right, and that the institutions and all the smart people were wrong. If you were smart in, say, 1000 AD, you went to a monastery or cathedral school. Okay, that's where the smart people went. And if you went to the monastery and cathedral school, what were you taught? You were taught Christianity. And what does Christianity teach? Well, it teaches that we are fallen. Everyone's fallen, right? Today, what do the universities teach? Do they teach that people are fallen today, that people are good? No, people are racist, people are bad. People are fallen, and they need to be fixed. They need to be fixed of their sexist, misogynistic ways and all that stuff. For example, the church would say things like, well, lust is bad. Right? Lust is bad. But unfortunately, humans lust. They lust all the time. That's just what humans do. So, it was an impossible task. Like, you could not fix it because humans lust. Holding, different views of the genders, right? That's what humans do, right? Humans evolved that way. The genders co-evolved. So they're going to hold different views of genders. They're going to have different judgments of genders for different actions. An action that's okay for a girl is not okay for a guy, and vice versa. So there are lots of double standards here, and those double standards are a result of the biology. So what you see, a similarity between the modern secular universities and the old-timey monasteries and cathedral school, is the battle against biology. Masturbation's a sin, lust is a sin, gluttony is a sin. Eating a lot of food and getting fat as you're biologically programmed to do, that's a sin. See, all these sins. Your biology is a sin, basically, right? You are fallen. Your inherent nature is of being fallen. And I believe that is what they teach at the universities today. The sins are different, true, but it's the same kind of pattern. Both are humanistic. In the church, Christianity was a little bit unique compared to the religions prior. And that is, the Christianity was unique in that it had soul equality. This was not true. For example, the Hebrews, which ironically Christianity grew out of, the Hebrews held the view that Yahweh originally was one of the many gods, one of the pantheon of gods, but eventually the Jews came to the conclusion that Yahweh was the one and only God revealed to Abraham, and that all these other gods were false and didn't really exist. When the Jews were still in Egypt, they recognized that Yahweh was just the God of their tribe, kind of like the God of Babylon was just the God of Babylon, and the God of Ur was the God of Ur. There are many gods. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. But once you had the one true God, so you have Christianity, and Christianity, you have to have an interesting problem with Christianity, because you have, the Jews are the chosen people. That's what it says in the Old Testament. But on the other hand, all souls are equal before God. And the Jews are the chosen people. Why? Well, because that's what the Old Testament said, and Christianity grew out of Judaism, which was an old-timey ethnic-specific religion, right, like as the early religions were, and Christianity grew out of that, and so now you have Christianity out of the one side of the mouth saying Jews are special, and on the other side of the mouth saying nobody's special, right? All souls are equal before God. All souls are equal before God. Well, this means that rank doesn't matter, class doesn't matter, tribe or ethnic affiliation does not matter. None of these things matter in the eyes of God. And ultimately, and because we're a theocracy, and because the Pope is God's intermediary enforcing the will of God on earth, the will of God on earth is ultimately egalitarian, right? In theory, right? Of course, it doesn't actually work out that way when you have kings and neo-Lockean property norms and feudalism. So, but ultimately, you have eventually what happens is especially after the printing press, you started to have a revolt against the Catholic Church, and a revolt against some of the excesses of the Catholic Church, and what became to be known as Christian humanism. Right, we're all equal, all humans are valuable, and what we ought to do is value the well-being of all humanity. That's all humanism is. It's like, you could call yourself a nationalist, meaning that you advocate that which is in the well-being of your nation, however your nation is being defined. Well, humanism is just that. It's just what is in the well-being of all humanity. Now, if you are a Christian, and if you believe that this, your existence on earth is but a blink of an eye in terms of in relation to your eternal soul, then to be a humanist, you're not going to be too particularly concerned about the well-being of people on this earth. Okay, you're going to be concerned about their well-being in the afterlife. So you're not going to be concerned about inventions that make life in this world easier. You're going to be concerned that they're following God's plan, they're following God's will, so that they can get into heaven. Right? That's as if you care about them, as in not necessarily their flesh and bones, but their eternal soul. That's what you want to do. And so if you're a humanist and you believe in the afterlife, you want to make sure that they follow, right? And so they get into heaven. It's a very humanistic thing to do. It's a very caring thing to do. And I believe, and of course, out of Christian humanism, you have secular humanism. And that's why you get the term secular humanism. It's not just called humanism, it's called secular humanism, to differentiate it from its predecessor, Christian humanism, right? So you have this secular humanism, and also you have the heretic, who is the racist, and I've been over that. Back then you had the heretic or the witch. Witch, not as much, but you had the heretic. Today you have the racist, right? And the heretic had his lying tongues, and St. Thomas Aquinas did his definitive, beat down of the heretics. And today you have the definitive beat downs of the racist. I would say that the old churches had better definitions, or more consistent definitions of heretics, because they had consistent fines and punishment for each type of heresy. But whereas as I've said, I've made the case, and I don't need to talk about that anymore. The definition of racism is a bit more convoluted. So here's something. And my position is that modern universities are the secular equivalent of the old churches, and racist is the equivalent of heretic, and the universities today are where smart people congregate. And so you're going to get a bunch of great ideas, you're going to get a bunch of brilliant people, you're going to get a bunch of brilliant inventions and breakthroughs at these universities. And that's simply because universities are where the smart people go. All right, and let's not confuse that with the institution itself. All right, let's not confuse the technological advances that are done by people and groups of people with the organizational structure in which they are operating. Okay, let's not confuse those two. But what I'm saying is that, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. Your ideas are of social democracy and humanism, supporting the well-being of all humans. Just let's quickly here go ahead and just knock out humanism. Okay. In the year 1950, there were about 200 million people in the continent of Africa. Okay. Today, there's about 1 billion. Now, if you're a humanist, you support the well-being of all humans. Right? Okay. So, in relation, Britain's population remained about static. I believe it's about 50 million now, and it was about 46 million in the year 1950. If I'm off, I'm not off by that much. Britain's population, let's just say for the sake of argument, has been about the same over that same period. So now, are the concerns of the people in Africa 5 times as important as the concerns of the people in Britain compared to whatever it was in the year 1950? Right? You could say that in the year 1950, well, the continent of Africa was as important as the continent of Britain. And so the concerns of any African was 1/4 as important as the concerns of any one British person. However, as they expand their number, they're now 5 times as populous as, or they're now 5 times as populous as they were. So now the concerns of the entire continent of Africa is now slightly more important than the concerns of Britain, or something like that. I mean, what's the ratio? Where do you draw it? Or let's look at it another way. I have 10 kids. I can't raise them. Okay? Do you believe that all children need, equal opportunity? All children deserve an opportunity, right? Okay, well, I have 10 kids. I can't afford to give them the opportunity which you proclaim to which they are entitled, so you have to pay. Right? See how that works? So I have 10 kids, and let's say you have 2 kids, and you really invest in your kids. And you really invest in your kids, and your kids are good, my kids are crap. Can't say that. And anyway, if you're a humanist, I have 10 kids, you have 2 kids, and you invested more in your 2 kids than I did in my 10. Now, if you're a humanist, what you would have to say is not only are your 2 kids no more important than my 10, which any sane, rational person would say that they are, since my 10 kids are actually a net drain on the well-being of all society or whatever, but that every one of my kids is just as important and just as valuable as every one of your 2 kids. So meaning my kids in aggregate are 5 times as important as your 2. Right? It's stupid. It makes no sense. It reduces to absurdity very quickly. Let's say that one ought to be required to pay for poor people. Right? Oh, poor people are poor and they need help and they need all this good stuff. Okay, imagine a hobo. Do you think that people with money should be required? Imagine a hobo kid. Imagine just the most pathetic image you can imagine. Okay, so should people with money, should the money be forced to make sure this hobo person is taken care of? Do you think they should be forced to do that? If your answer is yes, well, okay, should they be forced to spend this money if that person did not exist? This is not a trick question. The answer is no, because he doesn't exist. Okay, so his mere existence, this poor person coming into existence, according to humanist tacit logic, it's not explicit. If it was explicit, you would. I'm making it explicit, so you can see how stupid it is. But the implicit logic of humanism is that by their coming into existence, you ought to pay. You are now required to pay for them because they now exist. Right? Some people somewhere had a kid, therefore they exist. Right? And so humanism breaks down because, well, what's human? whoever constitutes the bulk of humanity, their concerns are now preeminent, right? So all you have to do is become humanity, come into existence, which is not hard nowadays. It was harder in the past, but it's not hard nowadays, okay? I mean, people in the poorest countries on the planet are exploding in population. And their interests become preeminent, right? And that's absurd. And so that's what I call the absurdity of humanism. And you could try to draw a line somewhere and say, well, at some point you say, look, you're not as important. Oh, can't say that. It's just stupid. It's just stupid. And it comes from religion. It comes from Christianity. It comes from God. East Asian countries, especially before their contact with the West, unfortunately, they're getting. It sound weird saying this, but unfortunately, they're getting corrupted and poisoned by Western Christian humanist thought. Japanese didn't think this way. They didn't care about the well-being of all humanity. They cared about the well-being of their group, however whatever that may be, right? And that's how most humans have thought throughout most of history. Hopefully, I don't need to argue that. And that's also how most people act in their day-to-day lives. If you were to live humanist ideals into day-to-day lives, what would you look like? Well, you'd give up all your earthly possessions. You'd live a hand-to-mouth existence. Well, doesn't that sound familiar? Doesn't that sound like, no sooner will a rich man get into heaven than a camel pass through the eye of a needle, or whatever Jesus said on that? That's interesting. That is interesting. How if you actually lived out secular humanist / Christian humanist ideals, you would be reduced to the same sad state. And, of course, people in their day-to-day lives, you reject humanism by practicality whenever you buy, a Frappuccino. Or whenever you buy anything you don't absolutely need. Like that money could have gone to some starving kid in Africa, right? So whenever you have, whenever you buy something other than the bare necessities, well, you bought a hamburger, you could have bought a bag of rice, and by buying the hamburger, well, that's more active denial of humanism, when you could have given it to people in need. And of course, the welfare programs in the U.S., they themselves are denial of humanism, because there are people in the U.S. who need help, but there are a lot more people in Africa who are in much worse situation than the people in the U.S. who are actually receiving stuff, right, from Medicare, Medicaid, income security, Social Security, food stamps, all those things. So what was I talking about? I was getting off topic here a little bit, and I lost my train of thought. Well, the point I'm making is that which is more likely that today the universities and the general ideology, which I call social democracy and humanism, that these are wrong, just like their predecessors, and they come from largely these universities whose predecessors hold a lot of similar traits that I believe have just become secularized. Which is more likely, that there has in fact been a radical break? I mean, because what am I saying? I'm saying that there has been no radical break except for the denial of God, right? I'm saying that God is dead, but the music is still playing, all right? Whereas people like Concordance, or people who are real big fans of Obama, or have this optimism in social democracy, or these people, you see these commenters from European states who are just out of their mind, who believe that social democracy is going to lead to some great thing, that these people, which is more likely? That it's just a continuation of the old shit in a kind of a secularized form because God is kind of dumb, or that it's just a brand new thing, that humanity has fundamentally changed and fundamentally made has changed, not only in terms of, learning new math formulas and learning new technological things. I mean, that happens all the time, but a completely new rational view of the world, that people today are becoming uniquely more rational than they have ever been, and that this is not just an extension of Christian humanist bullshit, right? Which is more likely, because I'm saying that no such radical transformation has occurred, and that people are still shitty like they were in 1000 AD. It's just dressed in different garbs. That's what I'm saying, and I think that's a much safer assumption, right? Because I think that the assumption of no progress is much safer than the assumption of radical, never before happened progress. Okay. And given that that's the safer assumption, if you're a humanist and if you're a social democrat, in addition to you holding an ideology which exists in contradistinctions to lots of other ideologies from lots of other places and times, means that, we got these two ends of Bayesian inference, right? Bayesian reasoning, one of which says, well, gee, there's a lot of other ideologies. Most of them are wrong. If you hold one of these particular ideologies, you're probably wrong. And then on the other hand, we have, the ideas that you hold come out of the Christian church, and in fact, the university system itself, the humanism, the we are fallen nature, the manful battling against your own biological drives, all that crap, we can trace it institutionally. All right, the kinds of people who buy into secular humanism and the kind of people who buy into this kind of secular we are fallen crap are people from formerly Christian states, right? You don't see this crap going on in Japan, not as much. Unfortunately, that's changing a little bit. But you didn't see this crap going on in Japan before they had any contact to it. Okay, so all this secular humanism and this we are fallen and this obsession over racism, as if a racist is a heretic, this comes from and is almost exclusive to formerly Christian areas, right? The post-Christian world, right? So it's clearly an extension of that. Okay, and if you say that's wrong, what are the odds that the secular extension of it are correct? That's probably wrong too. And being an ideology, it's also probably wrong in contradistinction to all other ideologies, right? Now I know what people are saying is like, well, Fringe Elements, you hold an ideology. Yes, I do. So, and because you hold an ideology, we would say that your ideology is probably wrong. Well, just on that kind of an analysis, yes, you would say that. Of course, I think my ideology is correct, which is why I hold it. And I defend that, but that's not what this video is about. If you just do a superficial analysis, recognize that I hold an ideology, and you don't hear any, and you don't know anything else, you don't have any other arguments for it, then yeah, your best assumption would be that I'm wrong, right? Because most ideas are in fact wrong. That's true. But anyway. I do this. I had like a great conclusion, and then I fucked it up by random thoughts. Okay, but yeah. Quick summation. If you're a social democrat humanist, you need to recognize that your views are a result of an historical progression, and if you hold the popular views at any place in time throughout history, almost all of them are wrong because there's so many of them. Okay, and like the odds that you are correct, given that your views are, by any rational inference, or like you have all these things going on, it would be unbelievably unlikely to say that the modern social democrat, we are fallen, racist, heretic, secular humanist view is not an outgrowth of Christian humanism, given that it is institutionally, and given that it is terminologically in terms of Christian humanism and secular humanism, right? just mind-boggling coincidence it would be that this is not in fact just an extension of the old crap that existed in the Middle Ages. Okay, your position is that it's not that, and that it actually represents an unprecedented fundamental change in the way people are thinking, which I don't think it is. I think it's just more bigotry, more church bigotry. You know, this humanism, this secular humanism, it's not the overcoming of base biological, racial, tribal, identities. It's just a new church. It's just conformity overwhelming that. Conformity to the ideas of the new church, the new cult, is overwhelming that. Overwhelming these other biological tendencies. Because humans have a biological tendency to conform, as well as a biological tendency to be racially nationalistic, and also nationalistic in their primary unit in levels lower than their race and in their family and stuff like that. And I've talked about that, how people actually identify at a biological level in other videos and stuff like that. But yeah, if you're a humanistic social democrat, you know, before even getting into any arguments about the policies that you support and the manifest failure of states that oppose economic freedom, right? Compare states like Singapore, Hong Kong, United Arab Emirates to states like, you know, Germany, France, and Britain. Compare a country which for a long time was higher on the index of economic freedom than the United States, Denmark. Compare that to a country far lower than the United States, Sweden, right? And you know, there's all sorts of other arguments against that. But before even getting into any of that, and before getting into a rebuttal to the healthcare thing, which I believe is the supposed jewel in the crown of advocates of social democracy, just standing back, before even talking about any of that, the history points to you probably the history says that you're very unlikely to be correct, and you're overwhelmingly likely to be wrong. So if you're a humanist, secular humanist, social democrat, you're probably wrong.